Page 111, September of 1853. Dear Austin, I feared Moses was right. Jupiter and I couldn't free a horsefly from the likes of this place. Oh, Austin, it's a terrible business, this selling of people. I suppose I should first tell you how we came to leave Moses and our group. Everyone was dozing, and the minute Moses shut her eyes, Jupiter signaled to me. I didn't know what he had in mind, but I did know he wanted me to follow him. So up we got, and I stayed close behind as Jupiter tiptoed past the silent group. "Where you headed?" a deep voice suddenly heard. We turned back to see Moses reaching for her gun in the moonlight. Jupiter latched onto my arm and grabbed the front of his breeches. He's got to relieve himself," I stammered. "And he's afraid of snakes, so I have to go along," I quickly added. Moses nodded, but held onto the gun. "Don't you stray too far." When we had made our way behind some bushes, I unbuttoned my breeches. "How do you know I had to go?" I asked Jupiter, who was standing beside me. He seemed impatient and pointed to a stand of pines that ran along the creek. "What's over there?" I asked. Jupiter brought his finger to my lips to silence me. Then he pointed to me and to himself and back to the creek. "Are you saying that you wanted us to leave?" I whispered. He quickly nodded in agreement. "But Jupe, you heard what she said." I tried to persuade him to go back with me to Moses and the others, but he looked at me in the eye and did the only thing that could have shut me up. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a little scrap of a yellow hair ribbon. One look at that ribbon was all I needed. I know he could never leave her alone down there or down here, not after hearing about the whip and those devil dogs. "We'd best hurry afore they come looking for us," I whispered. And that's how we came to be back on our own, heading south again. At least this time we had some idea of which way to go. One of the men had said that the auction was 2 miles south of the creek. Following Moses's map, we found the North Star and figured which way south was. We took off for the creek, running as fast as we could. Every now and then we'd stop to catch our breath and listen. We did hear voices once, but they sounded far off, and we knew they'd be heading in the opposite direction. We didn't make the full 2 miles that night, as the woods were so overgrown it was slow going. Along the way I couldn't stop thinking about Winston, the preacher, and the Underground Railroad. As I started to piece things together, I began to think aloud about Miss Amelia. I always wondered how she came to know so much about the Underground Railroad, and if she and the preacher were really sweet on each other and wouldn't have told her about it, and maybe she had even helped. That's when it dawned on me. "All those pies!" I suddenly cried. Jupiter shot me a guilty look. "Miss Amelia's pies weren't just for the preacher and his pa, were they? She was baking for the railroad, wasn't she?" Jupiter nodded. It suddenly all made perfect sense, and yet made no sense if you know what I mean. Can you believe it, Austin? Our own Miss Amelia working for the Underground Railroad? I couldn't get it all out of my head, and it felt like I cheated somehow. Cheated that Miss Amelia hadn't told me herself. But as hurt as I was over Miss Amelia's secret, I didn't have time to think on it much the next day. I slept the next morning. We woke up with the birds that had started to sing in the branches of the trees over our heads. We found some berries to eat, but after the hard track, my stomach was aching for real food. We were able to find the road that ran above the creek, and we followed it south, careful to keep out of sight. After a few hours, we heard horse wagon wheels, and singing. It weren't happy singing, but rather a low, mournful tune. When we kept up the edge of the woods, we could see wagons filled with slaves rolling over the dusty road. Young and old, men and women, boys and girls, and babies sleeping in their mothers' arms. Many of the men were in the chains, and some had big iron collars around their necks. They were herded into the wagons like cattle. Most were quiet, but few were singing. We followed along, keeping to the bushes until we reached a pebbled drive that ran into a yard. From the bushes we could see all manner of buggies, traps, and wagon parked at the hitches posts. There were sheds and pens, and crowds of people were gathered around platforms raised off the ground. I told Jupiter that he dare not come any further, for if any of those slave traders saw him, there was no telling what would happen. We agreed that would stay hidden in the bushes behind a shed while I went into the yard to look for Darcy. I promised that I'd get back to him, and we would somehow figure out what to do next if I found her. But the farther I walked into the yard, the more uncertain I became that we would ever figure a way out. The first thing I passed was a platform that had a large set of scales. A man in chains stepped onto it to be weighed. The man reminded me of Winston. He was tall and strong, only his eyes were different. They stared out of the crowd, blank and empty, as if they were looking right through the people, not seeing anything at all. 175 pounds plus chains. Let the bidding start. Let the bidding start at $7 a pound, the white man beside him shouted. I'll give you 500, a heavy-set man in a wide leather hat called. Why, I couldn't let him go at that price, the auctioneer replied, spitting a plug of tobacco off the platform. Just have to look at his back, he said, turning the old man around and pulling his shirt. Those are old scars. This buck had the wildness whipped out of him long ago. He's been broken in, and all you have to do is set him down in your fields. Why, he's been bred for the fields. Can't y'all see that? Who'll give him $800? I hurried past them and came to a row of pens. I was expecting to see pigs or cattle in them, but instead they were filled with people. The stench and dirt from the stench and dirt was something terrible. There were babies crying, whims cracking, men shouting at birds and spitting juice. A woman was pleading not to be separated from her children, and there was a boy about your age whose back was so scarred from whip marks I had to turn away and could not look. I kept searching for Darcy, hoping to catch sight of those yellow ribbons of hers. I stood watching and waiting as a pen was opened and the overseeing cracks as a big black snake whipped. Halls! He shouted. Elizabeth Nail and his Pearlie. A woman came out from of the pen with two little girls. The overseer cracked the whip beside the woman's feet, and she nearly jumped onto the platform. The little girls held onto her skins. Now we can sell 'em as a lot. Now we can sell 'em as a lot. $2,000, or we can split 'em up, the auctioneer called. You're looking at a healthy breeder wrench. Not all day over 20. Take the young uns as a pair to be raised up for the house of the field, or however you can use 'em. The little girls clung to their mother with their heads buried into her skirts. A trader stepped up on the platform and put on a pair of white gloves. He nodded to the woman, and the overseer cracked his whip. Open your mouth, the auctioneer barked. The woman opened her mouth, and the trader ran his fingers over her teeth, just like he was examining a horse. Cup worms in her teeth, the trader grumbled out loud. She's closer to 30 than 20. I'll give you 500 for her, but I don't need the rest. Do I hear 600? The auctioneer shouted. The woman began to sob and shake, and the little girls started to cry as they were pulled from her. I felt my stomach tighten into knots as I realized the only thing that was keeping me from being up there on that auction block was the whiteness of my skin. And Austin, I looked down at my hands, then my white hands, and I felt such shame. Son, if you ain't buying, you best be making room for one who is. I burning man growled as he leaned beside me. His breath was hot and smelled of whiskey. I stepped to the side and heard a young girl's voice call, Levi! I spun around to see a dirty canvas curtain pinned over a set of stalls. I heard the voice again, but I couldn't make out the words. Was she calling Levi or Eli? Was it Darcy or someone who sounded like her? There were so many voices and so much noise, it was impossible to tell. Darcy! I shouted. Darcy, you in there? I suddenly recalled all the names had I had told her to hush up all the time. I had wished she'd leave us alone and stop making so much noise, and I felt my heart twist in my chest at the memory. Darcy, I pleaded, it's me, Levi. Just let me know if you're in there. I couldn't see the faces inside the stall, and the overseer told me, move aside and stop disturbing the stock. Then he cracked his whip and lifted the curtain. Stock? That's how they think of them. That's how they were thinking of Darcy. How could these men, these grown men, be so wrong-headed, Austin? How does that happen? I may only be a boy, but I know the difference between an animal and a little girl. And to be truthful, Austin, these men were treating these people worse than animals. I stood on the edge a of a trowel so I could get a good look, but there were too many people packed in and not enough time to see them all before the curtain came back down. The voice that thought to be Darcy's was lost in all the shouting and sobbing. When I realized there was at least 10 of these pins and platforms with bidding going on all the same time, my hopes sank. How could I watch all of them? How was I ever to find Darcy if she was in here? I dreaded going back to Jupiter with this news, but I knew he'd be anxious by now, and so I headed back to the bushes where I'd left him. When I got there, he was gone. I searched everywhere, but couldn't find him. I was desperate with worry, and my head was reeling with questions. Had he gotten scared and decided to wait back in the woods? Had he hoped to hook back up with Moses and her group again? Why hadn't he waited for me? It wasn't long before I had my answers, for as I stood with my back to a platform, I heard an auctioneer call out, "What'll you give for this healthy-looking young buck? Why, just look at his back. Not a mark on it. No, sir." I was about to walk away when I heard the auctioneer's excited voice declare, "And this he comes with this here finely carved walking stick. Bet he worked it himself. Why, this little bird at the top looks like it's ready to take to the sky. That's a talent with wood, that is. Just how talented are you, young buck? Let's see how talented you are with your feet. Can you dance for these fine folks?" The overseer cracked his whip. The crowd roared with laughter. Stunned, I turned my head to time to see the auctioneer waving Darcy's walking stick in the air, and beside him on the platform stood Jupiter, stripped to the waist, his eyes wide with fear as the overseer whip cracked across his leg. "Oh, Jupe!" I cried. "Oh no! Oh no! I am out of paper and can write no more. Levi."